Good Yontif. Imagine for a moment, if you will, what it might have been like to be Elvis Presley's rabbi. Rabbi Albert Fruchter held that distinction. He and his wife, the Rebbitzin Jeanette, lived upstairs from Vernon and Gladys Presley and their young son in Memphis, Tennessee in the early 50s. Times were tough. When Elvis released his first single in 1954, he didn't even own a record player to play it on. So the Fruchters, who were going away for the summer, lent him theirs. It was a relationship that was mutually respectful and beneficial. Later on, Presley was quoted as saying about the rabbi and his family, "Oh, we used to live underneath him on Alabama Street. He was really nice to me. He'd loan me money, and sometimes he'd ask me to turn on the lights for him on Shabbat, on Saturday." So before he shook, rattled, or rolled, Elvis Presley was, as the term was once used, and although perhaps found by some to be offensive, is still used today, a Shabbos goy. And even though that term is not as comfortable as it once was, for a century it was considered an honorable and even well-appreciated role, even an essential one in the Jewish community. To be the non-Jewish person who helped out Jewish families by doing things on Shabbat that they could not do for themselves on the holy day. To relight a fire that had gone out, to turn off a light or appliance that was perhaps unintentionally left on. Maybe you yourself remember from your youth having had that experience of calling the neighbor downstairs, upstairs, next door to come fiddle with something on Saturday afternoon. There have been a surprising number of world figures who had a similar relationship. Colin Powell, military leader, Secretary of State, met Israel's Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, and he opened the conversation, much to everyone's shock, in not-so-terrible Yiddish. Men kämpft reden Yiddish. Shamir, stunned, did not realize that General Powell had grown up in a heavily Jewish neighborhood in the Bronx. In addition to picking up a smattering of, as they call it, the Mama Lushan, working at Sixer's toy store, he earned a few bucks by going around the neighborhood on Shabbat and holidays, turning on stoves, and so on. Figures as distinguished as Al Gore, Harry S. Truman, Martin Scorsese have proudly recounted playing this unique role in a Jew's Sabbath observance. And so this evening, I want to share a little bit with you about how this idea has played itself out in Jewish law and history, but even more so, what its implications might have for us, far beyond literal observance of Shabbat. It causes us to think about how do Jews think about our neighbors and how do they think about us. It causes us to question beyond religion. How do we feel about the dirty jobs, as it were, that we don't want to do and that we decide to leave for others? How does it make it feel about ourselves? Now, by the way, there are other times in ritual life when we push off an undesirable task. Tomorrow morning, we'll read about a service that took place in the Holy Temple on Yom Kippur. The high priest was at his holiest, most stunningly dressed. He was washing his hands and feet, immersing in a mikveh, going back and forth between pure linen vestments and the stunning regalia of the high priest. And then there was a scapegoat to be sent into the wilderness to carry off the sins of the Jewish people. All of the sins of the Jewish people converged on this one poor animal that was to be sent off into the wilderness. And there was some poor zhlub, described in the Torah as an ish iti, whose job it was to take that goat into the desert, and as we like to say in New Jersey, make sure he did not return. Once he had performed that duty, even this ish iti, the man sent with the goat, was too far from Jerusalem to be able to return for the rest of the holiday. He was stuck out there in the wilderness until after dark. And in any case, he was rendered ritually impure. And so we can ponder, what is the ritual work, what is the communal dirty work that we would rather leave to others? Now, on some level, this idea of a Shabbos goy seems very logical. According to Jewish law, there are 613 commandments that are binding on Jews. A whole body of ethical and ritual obligations. There's like a whole book of them. What we eat, what we don't eat, observing festive days, how we treat each other. And in particular, on Shabbat, the command is to refrain from creative work, to refrain from anything that causes a change in the state of the world. Lighting a fire, any kind of cooking or agriculture, construction, or even operating the equipment that performs many mundane duties. In contrast, non-Jews are only obligated in 7 basic ethical obligations. Don't murder, don't steal, don't worship idols or curse God, don't engage in egregious sexual immorality or eat an animal while it is still alive, and have a justice system. So they are not obligated in any of these other commandments. So this suggests a kind of symbiosis. I observe Shabbat, they don't. They observe Christmas, I can pick another day to go to the movies and eat Chinese food. And so in fact, here at B'nai Torah, we partner on a pinch hitters program where we volunteer so that staff for whom Christmas is a more important day can observe it with their own families. And I guess in return, someone could come to my house and light the oven. But not so fast. Because the 10 Commandments, when they speak of Shabbat as recounted in Exodus, read as follows. Lo ta'asel kol melacha, don't do any work, you and your son, your daughter, your servants, male and female, your ox, your donkey, or your animal, and the stranger, the non-Jew in your midst. This is remarkable. Even in the midst of talking about a distinctive practice of Shabbat, the Torah, God, understands that we are a community that has embedded within it others who are welcome part of our community. And when Deuteronomy recounts the 10 Commandments, it adds, L'man yanuach avadcha ve'amatcha kamocha. Your servants must rest like you. That you can't be sitting like a king on Shabbat while others are figuratively or literally slaving away. That Shabbat, if it is not observed by everyone, is meaningless for no one. And so even though in theory only Jews are obligated to rest on Shabbat, the implication is that Shabbat is meant to be universal. Everyone deserves a day off. Your household, your workers, your neighbors, your friends. Having a non-Jew violate Shabbat on your behalf is also a violation of Shabbat. The early rabbinic sources agree with this concern, but come up with different derivations. A very early commentary called the Mechilta derives the same principle from a different verse in Exodus. Maimonides says, oh no, it's not for the sake of the non-Jew. They can do whatever they want. But how are you going to feel about Shabbat if you get used to having work done by other people? Like it's almost like it isn't Shabbat. You might even come to forget and do it yourself. The Talmud then poses a question, where are the lines? So for example, if there's a fire at your house on Shabbat and non-Jewish firefighters come to put it out, can you let them? So let me be clear, if there are people trapped and lives to be saved, the answer is everyone get a bucket. But what if it's just stuff? And so the Talmud concludes, well, you don't ask a non-Jewish person, but if they're already there, you don't have to stop them. Now, house fires are, fortunately, quite rare. But what about more normal circumstances? What about a more commonplace situation that is almost as serious? A quandary of religious observance that I often encounter in rabbinic discussion groups. A disaster, a concern of almost equivalent seriousness. What if it is Shabbat, and you really, really, really need coffee on Yom Kippur even? Let me preface this by saying that I am not a coffee drinker. Our synagogue leadership maintains something known as the Heller Beverage Index, the HBI, if you will. If I am drinking water, Coke Zero, or Scotch, all is right with the world. Diet Mountain Dew, things are getting serious. Red Bull, assume crash positions. If I am drinking coffee, the HBI has only reached coffee 3 times in the past decade. So take what I am saying with a grain of non-sugar, non-calorie sweetener. Making coffee in the traditional way could lead to all kinds of violations of Shabbat. Grinding up and roasting the beans is like cooking, although you could do that before Shabbat. Bringing water to a boil is considered to be a violation of Shabbat. Putting the beans in the boiling water, you're cooking the beans. So what's to be done? Well, in many Orthodox communities, the answer is you use instant coffee, which is considered to be already cooked, and according to my friends who drink coffee, is actually not considered food anyway. And you ensure that the water is at best lukewarm. No one is suing McDonald's over the status of coffee made on Shabbat. And by the way, it turns out this is not a new question. Over the summer, I read an article by Dr. Maoz Kahana. He's a professor at Tel Aviv University. He reviewed the minutes of the board of the Jewish community of Prague in the 1750s and 60s. Imagine reading like decades worth of board meeting minutes. You might need coffee. And so it turns out that amongst the questions that this community found, and I apologize, most pressing, there's a few more of these, I'm sorry, was the question of coffee on Shabbat. In 757, the question came up, Jews were going to the coffee house instead of going to synagogue. And in fact, being seen with coffee on Shabbat, said the rules of the community, was grounds for a heavy fine. Like, I'm glad one person appreciates. It's nice, okay? Then there was a war, and people realized we need our coffee a little bit more. And then every couple of years, the question would come up again. Like, okay, fine, we'll let you do it when shul is not in session. By 1774, the assumption was that coffee houses would be open on Shabbat. The only restriction was that they were only permitted to sell to Jews. The idea was that they could trust that the Jews would pay in advance, and the beans would have been roasted and cooked by a non-Jewish employee of the coffee house. So, where there is a will, there is a way, apparently. But what we see from this is that on paper, there is this blanket prohibition on asking a non-Jew to do work for you on Shabbat. There's nothing you can ask them to do, unless you could also do it yourself on Shabbat without violating the observance. And yet, over time, the seams get torn and torn until the holes are about as big as the blanket itself. I will not review with you the scope of this entire area of Jewish law this evening, something for which I'm sure you are quite grateful. But the rabbis created all of these areas of exemption. So, for example, one may benefit from the labor of a non-Jewish person if the non-Jewish person is doing it for their own sake. So, for example, if a non-Jew happens to make a big pot of coffee and drinks only 1 cup, the other 99 are available for anyone who comes for Kiddush. Or similarly, it is easier to justify if the non-Jewish person is doing it on their own without specific direction. So if you send out your laundry, your dry cleaning, It's up to them if they do it Friday or Saturday, or if it's something they do all the time. Also, it's okay as long as you don't tell them. So arose this practice of hinting. So the idea is you're like, hey, it's really dark in here. And the custodian is supposed to get the hint. We had one guy who worked here and said, hey, can you come check on the lights in the chapel? He came, flipped the switch on. Yep, they work. Flipped them off again. You've been very helpful. Thank you. Or, if there's a way to do it that's okay on Shabbat, they can decide to do it their own way. So, for example, it is permissible to carry stuff on Shabbat, and there's stuff that has to go back and forth to Weber for the holiday. We ask our non-Jewish staff to schlep it. The fact that they choose to do it in a car rather than carrying it up Abernathy, that's on them. However they want to do it is fine with me. A major one is that if someone is ill, if someone has an acute, life-threatening illness, of course, you take them to the hospital yourself. You don't mess around. But what if someone is somewhat sick? Not going to die, but so sick they can't get out of bed. In that case, you can ask a non-Jewish person to do what they need, even though it is not life-threatening. And this is a huge loophole. So, for example, in Northern Europe, everyone agreed that you could have a non-Jew come and reload your furnace, your wood-burning stove, on Shabbat. Because they said, all are considered to be ill in the face of the cold. If you have ever spent February in Poland, you know that if you don't have a fire going, they're going to have to thaw you out for Havdalah. And also, if it's for the sake of a mitzvah, the sake of the community. So, for example, in the classic codes of Jewish law, there's a debate. Can you have a non-Jew light candles for a Shabbat dinner or for a bris? Now, by the way, you don't have to hint, hey, it's pretty dark in here for the mole. Now, by the way, to some extent and in many ways, the issue of the Shabbos Goy has become less critical than it was in Brooklyn or in Mississippi a generation ago. Because there are now Shabbos clocks for lamps. Many appliances, if you look in the manual, have a Shabbos mode so that they can operate safely. The dishwasher knows to wait until after dinner to run. We have a smart thermostat in our house that without any intervention knows how to pick exactly the right temperature so that I am too cold and Wendy is boiling every night of the week. On the other hand, there are new needs. So if you were staying in a hotel over Shabbat, hotels used to have physical keys. Now, with all the key cards and electronics, if you are trying to get in and out of your hotel room on Shabbat and you are strictly observant, at that hotel you are in for heartbreak. Another example. I wrestle. You missed it, it's too late. I wrestle with the implications of streaming on Shabbat and holidays. What we're doing right now, by the way. Obviously, the sociological concerns are big. What I can see is that there are more people watching us out there than there are here. And by the way, there's a nice number of people here. But I also want to think, what does that mean for the flavor of Shabbat? We make use of all the loopholes. We're worried about health. I know that there are people who are watching from home right now because being in a crowd is dangerous for them, or because they have a health issue where just being able to leave the house is too much of a challenge, and everyone else is benefiting from that. You could also say, hey, this is kind of a mitzvah. We also know that our AV staff also work for us at times when it is not Shabbat, or not yet Shabbat. They would sometimes argue that I am not giving them clear direction. I like to think that they're doing it for their own sake, that Melissa and Marty just love watching services. Maybe they do. But all loopholes aside, I wrestle with the fact that we, as a congregation that values observance, even though everyone has their own way of doing it, that we rely on people who are not Jewish to make it possible for us to do what we do. And that's the thing that Maimonides was concerned about. Once people get used to doing something by having a non-Jew do it, they're stuck when they don't have that person. There's a story of a couple in Brooklyn. They relied on Joey, the local neighborhood boy, to come and turn up the stove, to turn down the lights. One Shabbat, he wasn't there, and a friend of his showed up instead. They saw Joey came the next week. They said, "Joey, thanks for sending your friend, but I'm wondering, where were you? We missed you." He said, "Oh yeah, it was my bar mitzvah last week." And by the way, the story of Elvis is ironically not so different. What Rabbi Fruchter of Memphis did not know, and his son only learned later, was that there was a Lithuanian Jew named Nancy Burdine who came to the U.S. in the 19th century. She passed away in 1867. Suspicious minds already see where this is going. Her great-granddaughter ended up in Tupelo, Mississippi, a woman named Gladys Love Smith, who married a guy named Presley. She was Elvis's mother. So I don't think there was ever a mezuzah in Graceland, but the king himself was a hunk, a burning Jew. And when Rabbi Fruchter found out he was, I assure you, all shook up. For those who observe Shabbat in the traditional way, these ritual questions are very real. But I am realistic that many of us in this room are not losing sleep over who turns our lights and our appliances on and off, who's cooking breakfast when. There's a bigger picture, and that's where I want to leave you tonight. This is what I want us to think about going forward. For centuries, Jews have had complicated relationships. One might even say love-hate relationships with our neighbors. Think about what it meant when your neighbors thought that you killed someone who was important to them. And by the way, your neighbors had actually killed your Uncle Murray. To then have to rely on each other for aspects of ritual observance. Jews had a perception of their neighbors as profoundly different and other, and non-Jews as well back to them. Did that weekly contact reinforce those barriers or break them down? Does it lead to greater understanding when Colin Powell speaks Yiddish to Yitzchak Shamir? Or does it lead us to be less respectful to each other? Or if a specific type of work is associated with one particular ethnic group, what stereotypes might that bring about? In Israel, where relationships between Jews and Arabs are already complex, it becomes tricky. Who performs essential labor, menial labor during the week on Shabbat? Another perspective. The fifth commandment is trying to say that everyone should have a chance to rest, that in a society, everyone is entitled to certain things. Shabbat exists, yes, because God took us out of Egypt. God didn't want anyone to be a slave. And Shabbat exists because for the world, God rested on the seventh day. What expense does our leisure have? When you think about all the people whose work you benefit from, do they get opportunities for time off? Are they protected if a family member gets sick? When you go to a restaurant, can the people who work there, not just the servers, but like the people washing dishes in the back, afford to eat there? Even if coffee is made in a Shabbat-friendly way, is coffee only for closers? Deep down, do you have stereotypes about who tends to be in certain professions? Or look at it another way. Many of us at one time or another can afford to put up our noses at some task because we know that if we don't do it, somebody else will. Many accountants and attorneys that I know have a colleague down the street to whom they refer the cases that they would rather not take. As a politician, sometimes you can argue for something wildly irresponsible, knowing that someone else will shoot it down and you don't actually have to implement it. As a rabbi, there are certain things that I know that I personally can't do and be true to my understanding of the Jewish tradition. Am I being disingenuous if I refer a friend, a congregant, to a colleague who, with the integrity of their own approach, doesn't have those same concerns? What if you're a teacher? Isn't it just easier to let that kid pass and then they're the fifth grade teacher's problem? As a parent, don't you sometimes say, gee, let somebody else's dad worry about this one? And I would say that in this congregation, we can think about that in our religious life as well. We have perhaps the parallel problem, not the Shabbos Goy, but the Shabbos Jew. Our ritual life, our Shabbat, our weekday services would not happen without a surprisingly small core of lay people, of volunteers. We don't need them to flip a light switch. We don't need them to turn on a stove, but they provide spiritual light and warmth. The people who know how to lead services, the people who are comfortable, who are doing the work to read Torah. What will we do without them? There are people who say, I don't need to help make a minyan, somebody else will do it. And then the day comes when you want to come to minyan, and who is there for you? That's not just true in our ritual life. It's true in everything we do. If you think about it, visiting the sick with our Kesher committee, serving on the Chaver Kadisha, do we say, somebody else will worry about this, I get to relax? Even in our financial life, we are very grateful. There are donors who make sure that we can keep the lights on, not just on Shabbat, but all the time. But all of you have cards at your places, and think about what you are able to do your share so that you are not purely relying on someone else to keep the lights on here. On this Kol Nidre Eve, what part of community life will you take on for yourself? Will you go to Rabbi K, who has a standing offer? Anyone who wants to learn to lead services, read Torah, anyone who wants to be more comfortable with the service so they can come for 15 minutes in an afternoon and help us pray? He is happy to help. What holy practice, what helpful practice, what financial commitment will you take on yourself rather than leaving to someone else? So, the idea of the Shabbos Goy has a long history in our sources, and I don't know how advanced technology, I don't know how AI will change things. And by the way, the world is very different. Many of us have non-Jewish people who are treasured part of our own families, of our own circles. What I do know is that it is one thing to think of a task as totally wrong or off limits for anyone. And there are things that should be ethically, ritually just off the table. But what does it mean to say, you know, this is wrong for me to do, this is beneath me, let that guy do it? Well, you know, this is beneath me, but it's fine for her. On this eve of Yom Kippur, what can we do to ensure that we apply the same ritual and ethical standpoints and standards to everyone, including ourselves? As we think about our responsibilities for the coming year, will we say, oh, I let somebody else worry about it? Or will we say, I didn't do everything, but you were always on my mind? Gmar Chatima Tova, wish everyone a good year.